Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. Death at the Whitmore Estate's sharp clang of a dropped tray echoed down the corridor, followed by a shriek. Within moments, the house was alive with hurried footsteps and hushed whispers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room, lowered her teacup with a slight frown. She had always believed that panic revealed more than it concealed. Rising carefully, she made her way toward the commotion. Miss Agnes Pickering, the housekeeper, stood trembling in the library doorway, a hand pressed against her throat. Lord Henry Whitmore loomed behind her, his usually composed face set in a rigid expression. Inspector Harold Grayson, already summoned by one of the staff, was fastening his overcoat as he stepped inside. The body of Arthur Finch lay near the fireplace. His silver hair was askew, his neat uniform wrinkled. A deep gash marred his temple, the dark stain of blood pooling beneath his head. Nearby, an overturned chair and scattered papers suggested a struggle. The heavy silver candlestick at his side left little doubt as to the murder weapon. Inspector Grayson exhaled sharply. "Burglary gone wrong," he muttered. "No signs of forced entry, but servants forget to lock up. Some thief startled by the butler and struck him down." Miss Marple did not respond. She stepped closer, her sharp blue eyes flicking over the scene. A small detail caught her attention: Arthur's left hand, curled rigidly around a golden cufflink. "Odd," she murmured. Grayson turned, irritated. "What's that?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Just that. Dear Mr. Finch was right." Grayson frowned, but before he could reply, Lord Henry cleared his throat. "This is a terrible tragedy," he said, though his voice lacked any real emotion. "Arthur has been with this family for decades, a most loyal servant." Miss Marple noticed his hands were clenched at his sides. Not grief, something else. That Eleanor Whitmore entered then, her eyes wide. "Arthur dead." She hesitated, as if uncertain how shocked she ought to appear. "He was found this morning," Grayson said gruffly. "Last seen alive after dinner." His gaze swept the assembled group. "Where was everyone last night?" "I was in my study," Lord Henry answered quickly. "Had business to attend to." Miss Marple glanced at him. That much was true. His desk still bore signs of recent work, but something in his tone struck her as too quick, too rehearsed. "I went for a walk," Eleanor said, twisting the ring on her finger. "Alone?" "Yes." Grayson sighed. "Convenient." Dr. Geoffrey Mills entered, fastening his cuff. "Terrible business," he said calmly, looking at the body with a professional detachment. "Cause of death is obvious, but I can confirm it formally if needed." Miss Marple glanced at him. He had arrived quickly, almost too quickly. Grayson nodded. "You were home last night, Doctor." "I was." No hesitation, but Miss Marple noted a faint redness around his wrist, where his cuff had been fastened too tightly. Nervous, she filed the thought away. A soft sniffle came from Miss Pickering, who had finally regained her voice. "It's awful, ma'am," she stammered, turning to Miss Marple. "Mr. Finch was always so proper. But he'd been different these past few days." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Different how, my dear?" Miss Pickering wrung her hands, nervous, almost watching people, scribbling things in his book, and she hesitated. "Yes, he locked his drawer before bed last night," she whispered. "He never did that." Miss Marple turned to Grayson. "Have you searched it?" The inspector grunted, motioning for a constable to break the lock. Within, a leather-bound journal rested on top of neatly arranged papers. Grayson flipped it open, scowling at the tightly written entries. Miss Marple peered over his shoulder. "The truth about Lady Whitmore's death may yet see the light of day. Too many secrets are hidden in plain sight." The room went still. Lord Henry's expression darkened. Eleanor shifted on her feet. Dr. Mills, for the first time, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Now, isn't that interesting?" A cold draft from the fireplace ruffled the edge of the journal, disturbing the ash near Arthur's feet. Miss Marple's sharp gaze dropped to the floor, where the faintest of smudges marred the hearth's smooth surface. Something had been moved. She looked at Arthur's hand again. A cufflink, a staged struggle, a missing page from the journal. Grayson was still speaking, declaring Arthur's death the work of an intruder. But Miss Marple was no longer listening. She touched the journal lightly and murmured, "No, this wasn't a burglary. This was something far more personal." Chapter 2. Secrets Among the Household. A heavy silence had settled over the Whitmore estates. Even the usually chatty housemaids moved with an air of subdued unease, whispering behind closed doors. Death, especially a violent one, had a way of making the grandest of homes feel oppressive. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening, not to the words being spoken but to the spaces between them, the hesitations, the unspoken tensions. There were always undercurrents beneath the surface. Inspector Grayson, in contrast, had taken 2 barking questions in a brisk, efficient manner. "Let's go through it again," he said, rubbing his temples. "Finch was last seen alive after dinner. That puts his time of death somewhere between 10 and midnight. Where was everyone?" Lord Henry Whitmore straightened in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "I have already told you, Inspector I was in my study attending to estate matters." Miss Marple glanced at him. His voice was smooth, but his fingers tapped against the armrest in an unconscious rhythm, a man trying to appear calm. Grayson scribbled something in his notebook before turning his sharp gaze to Eleanor Whitmore. "And you, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor hesitated. "I went for a walk." Grayson sighed. "Yes, so you said. Where, precisely?" "I don't remember exactly, just around the grounds." At that hour, Eleanor stiffened. "I often take walks when I cannot sleep." Miss Marple noted how Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she tucked a stray curl behind her ear. There was something unsaid here, though whether it was related to Arthur Finch's murder was another matter. Grayson turned next to Dr. Geoffrey Mills, who sat with the calmness of a man accustomed to unpleasant matters. "You arrived quickly this morning, Doctor." "I was summoned," Mills replied smoothly. "Where were you last night?" "At home." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "Alone?" Mills arched an eyebrow. "Yes. Unlike Lord Whitmore, I have no pressing estate matters to occupy my evenings." Lord Henry shot him a cold look, but said nothing. Miss Marple, ever so gently, intervened. "And you, dear Miss Pickering?" The housekeeper startled slightly, as if she had been hoping not to be noticed. "In my room, ma'am. I'd finished tidying and retired early." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile, and before that, Miss Pickering swallowed. I saw Mr. Finch in the library around 10. He seemed worried about something, though he didn't say what." "Did he mention meeting anyone?" Miss Pickering hesitated. "Not exactly, but he had a letter in his hand." Grayson frowned. "A letter?" She nodded. "I only caught a glimpse, but I saw him tuck it into his pocket." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Grayson. "When Mr. Finch was found," she said mildly, "was there any letter in his pocket?" Grayson's brow furrowed. "No." Silence settled over the room. Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head. "Letters do not vanish into thin air, Inspector. If it was taken, then the question is, who took it, and why?" Later that morning, Miss Marple wandered the corridors of the house, her mind quietly assembling pieces of the puzzle. It was not merely about who had killed Arthur Finch, it was about what he had known. The missing letter was troubling. Finch had been a butler, and butlers noticed things. Had he discovered a secret he was not meant to uncover? As she neared the study, a low voice caught her attention. "I tell you, Henry, we cannot afford a scandal." Miss Marple paused. Eleanor's voice, low, urgent. Lord Henry responded in a hushed, tense whisper. "Do you think I don't know that? But the timing of this is damnably inconvenient." "You think this is about that?" Eleanor's voice wavered. "I don't believe in coincidences, Eleanor." Footsteps. Miss Marple stepped quickly aside as the door opened and Eleanor nearly ran into her. "Oh," Eleanor gasped, her face flushed. I didn't see you there." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "A common hazard of country houses, my dear. So many corridors." Eleanor looked as though she wanted to say more but thought better of it. Instead, she hurried away. Miss Marple turned to Lord Henry, who studied her with a cool gaze. "Curiosity is a dangerous trait, Miss Marple. So is secrecy," she replied, and left him standing in the doorway. That afternoon, Grayson had the staff gathered in the great hall for formal questioning. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, knitting in her lap. "Observing now," Grayson began. "Let's be clear, this was not a random attack. Mr. Finch knew his killer." The room was silent. Grayson eyed the assembled staff. "Who here knew of any trouble Mr. Finch might have been in?" Nobody spoke. Miss Pickering swallowed hard. Grayson pounced. "Miss Pickering," the housekeeper's hands trembled. I don't know anything, sir, truly. Only yes." She looked down, hesitant. Last night, after everyone had retired, I heard something, a voice, raised. It came from the library. Grayson leaned forward. Whose voice? Miss Pickering hesitated. It sounded like Lord Whitmore. All eyes turned to Lord Henry, who remained impassive. I did speak with Arthur last night, he admitted, his voice measured. But it was hardly a heated argument. Grayson folded his arms. And what did you discuss? I asked him about some missing estate records. Miss Marple frowned. Estate records? Lord Henry gave her a sharp look, as though suddenly realizing how much she had been listening. Routine paperwork. Arthur had access to a great many things. Miss Marple smiled gently. Indeed. She turned her attention back to Miss Pickering. And after the voice, my dear, did you hear anything else? Miss Pickering nodded slowly. A thud, like something heavy falling. A silence followed. Grayson straightened. And what time was this? Miss Pickering bit her lip. A little after 10. Miss Marple's fingers stilled over her knitting. The time of death. She looked at Lord Henry. You said you left the library before the murder. Lord Henry's mouth tightened. I did. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then turned to Grayson. Inspector, I believe it might be useful to check Lord Henry's study. I have a feeling the missing letter may not be far. Grayson's expression darkened, but he nodded. Indeed. Lord Henry's gaze was unreadable, but Miss Marple did not miss the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly. A mixed reaction. As if he knew exactly where the letter was. Miss Marple folded her knitting. This was only the beginning. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Chapter 3. The missing letter. Inspector Grayson was not a man prone to enthusiasm. But Miss Marple's quiet suggestion had clearly unsettled him. He stood stiffly in Lord Whitmore's study, glancing about with a furrowed brow. The room was lined with dark wooden bookshelves, the scent of tobacco lingering faintly in the air. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, but it was not the official documents that interested Miss Marple. She took a step forward, running a finger lightly over the polished mahogany. You have a habit of keeping your study in good order, Lord Henry, she remarked mildly. Lord Whitmore folded his arms. A necessary habit for a man of my position. Quite, Miss Marple agreed. Her eyes drifted to the ornate letterbox on the desk. It was locked. Would you be so kind as to open this? Lord Henry's gaze sharpened. Surely you don't believe? Grayson cut in. Open it. For a long moment, it seemed Whitmore might refuse. Then, with a tight expression, he pulled a small key from his pocket and unlocked the box. The lid creaked open, revealing neatly arranged correspondence. Miss Marple stepped closer, tilting her head. Ah, how very interesting. Grayson, growing impatient, reached in and shuffled through the letters. He pulled out a half-crumpled envelope. No letter inside. Miss Marple took the envelope delicately. The writing was faded, but still legible. Arthur Finch's name. Grayson swore under his breath. So the letter was here. Lord Henry exhaled slowly. It would seem so. Miss Marple turned the envelope over, noting the faint remains of a wax seal. And yet, she murmured, it is gone. Lord Henry's face was impassive, but Miss Marple could sense his restraint. The man was guarding something. She turned to Grayson. We must consider the possibility that someone removed it after Finch's death. Grayson grunted. That narrows it down to the people in this house. Indeed, Miss Marple said cheerfully, but we mustn't be hasty. If the letter was important enough to steal, it is important enough to resurface. Lord Henry's lips thinned. Are you implying that someone will use it as leverage? Miss Marple smiled. I am simply suggesting that secrets have a way of revealing themselves. The morning air was crisp as Miss Marple strolled through the gardens, her mind quietly assembling the facts. Arthur Finch had been in possession of something valuable, so valuable that it had cost him his life. The missing letter must have contained something damning, but what? She stopped near the rose bushes, where Miss Pickering stood plucking at dead leaves with nervous fingers. Oh, Miss Marple, she said, startled. I didn't see you there. Miss Marple smiled gently. You seem troubled, my dear. Miss Pickering hesitated. It's just all so awful. I keep thinking if I had said something sooner. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You knew something, didn't you? Miss Pickering's hands twisted in her apron. Not knew, exactly. But I saw something the night Mr. Finch was killed. Miss Marple remained silent, letting the housekeeper gather her thoughts. It was late. Miss Pickering continued, voice hushed. After I heard the voices from the library, I was coming downstairs when I saw someone moving near the study. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Ooh, Miss Pickering swallowed. Dr. Mills. A beat of silence. He was standing near the door, Miss Pickering whispered. And when he saw me, he turned away quickly. Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against her chin. And he never mentioned this. No. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. You've been most helpful, my dear. Miss Pickering looked relieved but still uneasy. Do you think it means something? Miss Marple smiled. Everything means something, my dear. Dr. Geoffrey Mills was not an easy man to catch off guard, but when Miss Marple found him in the drawing room, his expression faltered just slightly at the sight of her. Miss Marple, he said smoothly, have you come to question me as well? Miss Marple chuckled. Oh, dear me, no. I simply wished to have a friendly chat. Dr. Mills arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Miss Marple settled into a chair. You must have known Arthur Finch quite well. Well enough, Mills replied cautiously. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, it is curious. I understand that you were near the study the night he died. A pause. Dr. Mills's fingers tensed slightly against the arm of his chair. Who told you that? Oh, just something I heard, Miss Marple said lightly. You see, I find it very interesting that the letter Mr. Finch received has disappeared, and that you were nearby on the very night it went missing. Dr. Mills smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? Oh, not at all, she said cheerfully. I am merely asking if you were near the study. Did you see anything unusual? Dr. Mills hesitated. No. Miss Marple watched him carefully. You are certain? Yes, he said firmly. Miss Marple sighed. Such a shame. I had hoped you might have noticed something. Dr. Mills did not reply. Miss Marple rose to leave but paused at the door. Oh, one last thing. Doctor. Yes, she smiled. You seem rather fond of cufflinks. Dr. Mills stiffened ever so slightly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A very fine choice of accessory. Good day, Doctor. Later that evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she considered what she had learned. Dr. Mills had been near the study. A letter had disappeared, and Arthur Finch had died holding a cufflink in his hand. A coincidence. She doubted it, and yet, there was more to uncover. As she placed her knitting aside, she recalled something Finch had once said in passing at a village gathering. A butler never tells, but sometimes he listens. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Tomorrow, she would listen. Chapter 4. A butler never tells, but he listens. Miss Marple believed that the dead often spoke in whispers through forgotten objects, hushed conversations, and the unease of the living. Arthur Finch might have been silenced, but his knowledge remained somewhere within this house, and so, Miss Marple listened. She sat in the drawing room, appearing as an unassuming old lady with her knitting in hand. The household moved around her, each carrying their secrets. The missing letter still lingered in her thoughts. Someone had taken it after Finch's death. But why? To hide something, to blackmail someone, or perhaps, because it contained a truth too dangerous to be known. She glanced up as Miss Pickering passed by, her apron folded neatly in her hands. My dear, would you happen to know if Mr. Finch kept a personal journal? Miss Pickering started. A journal? Yes, some butlers do, you know, an old habit, a record of the household's affairs. Miss Pickering bit her lip. I suppose it's possible. Mr. Finch was meticulous about details. Miss Marple smiled. And where might he have kept such a thing? Miss Pickering hesitated, then whispered, his room. He always kept his belongings in perfect order. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How very useful. Miss Marple found Finch's room to be as orderly as she had expected. Not a speck of dust out of place. His modest belongings arranged with the precision of a man accustomed to servitude. She ran her fingers along the bedside table, pulling open the single drawer. Inside lay a silver watch, a small notebook, and a bundle of letters tied with string. Carefully, she opened the notebook. Arthur Finch had indeed kept records, detailed notes on household affairs, visitors, and the peculiar happenings of the estate. As she flipped through the pages, one entry caught her attention. April 3rd. A visitor arrived late in the evening, not announced. Lord Whitmore seemed troubled after. Spoke with Dr. Mills in private. Something amiss. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the page. A visitor. She continued reading. April 7th. Found an envelope with a torn seal in Lord Whitmore's study, marked confidential. He was angry when he discovered I had seen it. No explanation given. A torn envelope, just like the one found in the Letterbox. Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened. Finch had known something. and it had been enough to cost him his life. She carefully closed the notebook. The answers were here, hidden between the lines. Inspector Grayson was less than pleased when Miss Marple summoned him. "You've been snooping again," he grumbled, though he took the notebook she handed him. "I prefer to think of it as observing," Miss Marple said sweetly. Grayson flipped through the pages, muttering under his breath. His expression darkened. "A visitor, and no record of any late-night callers, which suggests," Miss Marple said mildly, "that someone did not wish it to be known." Grayson tapped the notebook with a finger. "You think Finch stumbled upon something connected to this visitor?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together. "I think Finch was a man who paid attention, and, unfortunately, he paid too dearly for what he noticed." Grayson exhaled. "We need to find out who this visitor was." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. Miss Marple took her next step carefully. She found Eleanor Whitmore in the conservatory, staring out at the garden with a distracted air. "Such a lovely day," Miss Marple remarked. Eleanor startled, then forced a smile. "Yes, I suppose it is." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "My dear, may I ask, did your father receive any unexpected visitors in the last fortnight?" Eleanor's fingers clenched around the armrest of her chair. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple gave her a kindly look. "Because I believe Mr. Finch knew of one." Eleanor's face paled. Miss Marple waited. After a long silence, Eleanor exhaled. "There was someone." Miss Marple remained quiet, encouraging her to continue. "A man," Eleanor murmured. "He came late one evening. I didn't see his face properly, but Father was furious after their conversation." "Did you hear what they spoke about?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. But after that night, Father changed. He became anxious, even more secretive than usual." Miss Marple's mind raced. A visitor, a missing letter, Lord Whitmore's agitation. And Arthur Finch, caught in the middle. That evening, Miss Marple found herself once again in the drawing room, where Lord Whitmore sat brooding over a glass of brandy. "Terrible business, all this," he muttered. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, quite." Lord Whitmore exhaled heavily. "You've been asking questions." "Oh, I do apologize. Old habits, you know." His gaze sharpened. "And what have you found?" Miss Marple smiled, her hands folding over her lap. "That Arthur Finch was not merely a butler, but an observer of human nature." Lord Whitmore stiffened. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. "He saw something, didn't he? Something connected to your late-night visitor." A long silence. Then, very softly, Lord Whitmore said, "I told him to forget it." Miss Marple's heart tightened. "But he didn't." Lord Whitmore swallowed, his expression unreadable. "No, he didn't." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Who was the visitor, Lord Whitmore?" A shadow crossed his face. "A man I thought I had left behind long ago." Miss Marple's fingers curled around her knitting. "And what did he want?" Lord Whitmore hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "To remind me of an old debt." Miss Marple did not press further. She had learned when to wait. But as she left the drawing room, she knew this revelation had changed everything. A visitor, unknown, a debt, long buried, and Arthur Finch, who had listened to well. Chapter 5. The old debt. Miss Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she reviewed what she had learned. Lord Whitmore had admitted to a visit linked to an old debt. Arthur Finch had known of this encounter, and soon after, he was murdered. A curious chain of events, and yet, the missing letter remained a troubling gap. Someone had taken it, but had they destroyed it, or were they waiting for the right moment to use it? She was considering this when Inspector Grayson entered, his expression grim. "Miss Marple, I need a word." She set her knitting aside. "Of course, dear Inspector. Have you found something?" Grayson exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I spoke to Lord Whitmore again this morning, pressed him on this old debt business, and—" Grayson folded his arms. "He claims it was a private matter, nothing to do with Finch's death." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Ah, but secrets have a way of becoming entangled, don't they?" Grayson scowled. "That's what worries me. I did some checking. Turns out Lord Whitmore had financial troubles some years ago, serious ones." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "And this visitor, I presume, was connected?" Grayson nodded. "A man by the name of Charles Redford, former associate of Whitmore's in his younger days, a known gambler, disappeared from society after a financial scandal, and now, it seems, he's back." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her lap. How very interesting. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Eleanor Whitmore. She found the young woman in the library, absently tracing her fingers over the spines of books. Miss Marple approached quietly. "My dear, I wonder if I might ask about Charles Redford." Eleanor turned sharply. "Redford?" Miss Marple nodded. "A rather notorious figure. I understand." Eleanor's expression darkened. "If he's back, nothing good will come of it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then you knew of him?" Eleanor hesitated. "Not personally, but my father, he spoke of him once, years ago. Said he was a man who never forgot a debt." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A dangerous quality." Eleanor shuddered. If Finch knew about Redford's return, that would explain a great deal. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Indeed, Miss Marple decided that a conversation with Dr. Mills was in order. She found him in the study, his posture stiff as he perused a medical journal. He looked up as she entered, his smile tight. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple's voice remained light. "Oh, just a small curiosity, Doctor." Dr. Mills shut his journal. "Curiosity." Miss Marple nodded. "About Charles Redford." A flicker of something crossed Dr. Mills's face, gone almost too quickly to notice. "I'm afraid I don't know the man," he said smoothly. But Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but you were present the night Arthur Finch died, were you not?" Dr. Mills's fingers tensed. "I was." "And you were seen near the study?" His jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" Miss Marple ignored the question. "And yet, you claim you saw nothing of importance." Dr. Mills hesitated. "I did not say that." Miss Marple's expression remained kindly. "Then perhaps you might say now." Dr. Mills exhaled sharply. "Fine. I heard voices. Raised voices. I assumed it was Lord Whitmore arguing with someone." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "And yet, you said nothing of this before." Dr. Mills's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I saw no reason to." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "A strange omission, don't you think?" Dr. Mills did not answer. Miss Marple nodded to herself. "Yes, very strange indeed." That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she carefully reviewed the day's discoveries. Lord Whitmore owed a debt, one tied to Charles Redford. Arthur Finch had known about Redford's return. Dr. Mills had heard an argument but concealed it. And then there was the missing letter. She reached for her notebook, making a small note to herself. What did Finch know that was worth killing for? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Pickering stood there, pale and breathless. "Miss Marple, I found something." Miss Marple ushered her in quickly. "What is it, dear?" Miss Pickering hesitated, then held out a crumpled piece of paper. Miss Marple took it gently, unfolding it with care. And as her eyes scanned the words, her heart gave a small jolt. The missing letter. Miss Marple read the letter in silence. It was brief, but damning. "Lord Whitmore, your debt remains. I have waited long enough. I expect payment, or I will expose everything. You know what that means. Cr. Charles Redford." Miss Marple's mind whirled. Redford had returned to collect on his debt. But Finch had found the letter, and now Finch was dead. She looked up at Miss Pickering, who fidgeted anxiously. "Where did you find this?" "In the linen cupboard," Miss Pickering whispered. "Stuffed in an old bedsheet." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then someone was hiding it." Miss Pickering swallowed. "What do we do now?" Miss Marple folded the letter neatly. "We listen, my dear." Miss Pickering frowned. "Listen." Miss Marple smiled. "Because whoever hid this letter will soon come looking for it." And with that, she placed the letter safely in her pocket. Tomorrow, she would have her answers. Chapter 6. A visitor in the night. Miss Marple had always believed that patience was the greatest tool of any detective. One simply had to wait, observe, and allow the guilty to reveal themselves. And so, with the missing letter safely tucked inside her knitting basket, she waited. Someone had hidden that letter. Someone who knew its contents were dangerous. And now, with its absence noted, the guilty party would become uneasy. She only had to watch carefully. Morning, in the Whitmore household, was a tense affair. Lord Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his usual air of authority, weakened by a furrowed brow and an untouched plate of eggs. Eleanor was silent, stirring her tea absently. Miss Pickering flitted about, her usual efficiency slowed by nervous glances. Only Dr. Mills seemed composed, his movements precise as he buttered a slice of toast. Miss Marple took a careful sip of tea before speaking. "I do wonder, Lord Whitmore, if you've had any further thoughts on your visitor." Whitmore stiffened. "I told you, Miss Marple, it was a personal matter." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, indeed, and yet, such personal matters do have a way of turning into unfortunate circumstances." Dr. Mills set down his knife with a sharp clink, meaning Miss Marple's voice remained light, only that Mr. Finch was a most observant man, and observant men, as we have seen, sometimes meet unfortunate ends. A heavy silence followed. Then, abruptly, Lord Whitmore pushed back his chair. "If you'll excuse me." Miss Marple watched him go. Yes, there was something there, something that made him deeply uneasy, and she meant to find out what. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll through the village, not because she needed the fresh air, but because the best gossip was often found in the small murmurs of the townsfolk. Sure enough, as she passed the local shop, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two elderly women. "I swear, I saw someone outside the Whitmore estate last night." Miss Marple paused, her hand hovering over a display of biscuits. "Oh, nonsense," the other woman scoffed. "No one would be out at that hour." "I know what I saw," the first insisted. "A tall figure, lurking near the servants' entrance." Miss Marple's mind whirred. "A late-night visitor." She turned, offering a sweet smile. "Pardon me, dears, but I couldn't help overhearing. Did you say someone was seen near the estate?" The first woman beamed at the attention. "Oh yes, just past midnight, I think. A man, though I couldn't quite make out his face." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And which direction did he come from?" The woman frowned. "Seemed to be coming from the old coaching road." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. The coaching road lead toward the abandoned in the very same place Charles Redford had once been known to frequent. She had heard enough. That evening, Miss Marple positioned herself in the drawing room, knitting in hand, waiting. If someone had been sneaking about, they would surely try again. The house settled into uneasy silence. Lord Whitmore had locked himself in his study. Eleanor had retired early, and Dr. Mills had left for his usual evening walk. And so, Miss Marple listened. At precisely 11 o'clock, she heard it. A soft creak, a whisper of movement beyond the hallway. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose quietly, slipping out of the drawing room. The corridor was dark, but she had spent enough time in the Whitmore estate to know its every shadow. Figure moved near the study door. Miss Marple held her breath. The figure hesitated, glancing around, then reached for the handle. A hand, gloved and careful. A slow twist of the knob. Miss Marple took a step forward, looking for something. The figure started violently, spinning to face her. "Miss Pickering." Miss Marple folded her hands. "How curious, my dear, to find you creeping about at this hour." Miss Pickering's face was deathly pale. I couldn't sleep. I thought I heard a noise." Miss Marple's expression was kindly, but firm. "And yet, my dear, you went straight for the study." Miss Pickering swallowed hard. Miss Marple stepped forward. "The letter, I presume." Miss Pickering froze. Miss Marple nodded to herself. "You knew it had been taken, didn't you? And now you are searching for it." Miss Pickering's lips trembled. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Oh, my dear, I do believe you are afraid." Miss Pickering closed her eyes. "It's not what you think." Miss Marple waited. And, after a long silence, Miss Pickering whispered, "I saw him." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Who?" Miss Pick's eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in. "The night Finch was killed. I saw someone leaving the study." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "Who was it, dear?" Miss Pickering hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "Dr. Mills." Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence as Miss Pickering wrung her hands. Dr. Mills. The composed, careful doctor who had concealed the argument in the study. The man who claimed he had heard nothing of importance, and yet, he had been seen. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her lap. "Miss Pickering, you must tell the inspector." Miss Pickering looked terrified. "I can't. If Dr. Mills knows, I saw him." Miss Marple's voice was firm. "You must trust that the truth is the safest path." Miss Pickering exhaled shakily. "And the letter?" Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and withdrew the folded paper. "Safe." Miss Pickering's eyes widened. "You?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, my dear. And now we shall see who comes looking for it." Miss Pickering swallowed, nodding. Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. "All will be well, my dear. The truth always finds its way." But as she glanced toward the darkened hallway, Miss Marple knew this was far from over. Chapter 7. the doctor's secret morning. After Miss Pickering's confession, Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Across from her, Eleanor Whitmore was staring vacantly at a plate of untouched toast. Lord Whitmore was absent, likely locked away in his study, and Miss Pickering hovered about with a nervous energy that had not abated since the previous night. It was the arrival of Inspector Grayson that truly stirred the morning into motion. He entered with his usual briskness, nodding curtly to Miss Marple. "A word, if you please." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a pleasant smile. "Of course, Inspector. Shall we take a walk?" The Whitmore estate grounds were crisp with morning dew, the air fresh but holding an underlying tension. Inspector Grayson walked at a steady pace, hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You've uncovered something, haven't you?" he asked at last. Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "And you, Inspector, have come to the same conclusion, I imagine." Grayson exhaled sharply. "Dr. Mills," Miss Marple nodded. "Miss Pickering saw him leaving the study the night Arthur Finch was murdered." Grayson muttered a curse. "Damn fool of a man. If he was there, why didn't he say so?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "That, dear Inspector, is precisely what we must determine." Grayson sighed. "I'll have him brought in for questioning." Miss Marple's gaze twinkled. "Oh, I suspect that won't be necessary." Grayson frowned. "Why not?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because Dr. Mills will come to us." True to Miss Marple's prediction, Dr. Mills arrived at the Whitmore estate just before noon. He was composed as always, but there was a stiffness to his stride, a tension in his shoulders. Miss Marple and Grayson waited in the drawing room. As Mills entered, Grayson wasted no time. "You were seen leaving the study the night of the murder." Mills's expression barely flickered. "I see." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Is that all you have to say?" Mills exhaled, running a hand over his chin. "It was not my intention to withhold anything, but I had reasons." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Then do tell us, dear doctor, the truth, if you please." Mills hesitated, then nodded. "Very well." Dr. Mills's story was precise, clinical. He had been in the study that night, but not for the reasons they suspected. He had gone to see Arthur Finch. "Finch came to me earlier that evening," Mills admitted. "He said he had something important to discuss." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And what was it?" Mills's fingers tightened slightly. "He claimed he had proof of something about Lord Whitmore's past." Grayson's voice was sharp. "Did he show you this proof?" Mills hesitated. "No, he said he would tell me everything later. But when I returned to the study later that night, Finch was dead." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And yet you said nothing." Mills exhaled. "Because I had no proof of my innocence. I knew how it would look. I left before anyone could see me." Grayson studied him. "That's a damning omission, Doctor." Mills's jaw tightened. "I know." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "And this proof Finch mentioned. Do you believe it was in the letter?" Mills nodded. "It must have been." Miss Marple's gaze was unreadable. "Then, dear doctor, I believe we must ask who else knew about it." The answer came sooner than expected. That evening, a commotion in the hallway broke the tense atmosphere. Voices were raised, Lord Whitmore's, sharp with fury, and another voice, low and urgent. Miss Marple stepped into the hall just in time to see Charles Redford. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had once been handsome, but was now worn with age and misfortune. His eyes flickered with something dangerous as they met Lord Whitmore's. "You've been avoiding me, Whitmore," Redford said coldly. Whitmore's expression darkened. "Get out of my house." Redford smirked. "Not before we settle our business." Miss Marple's voice was deceptively mild. "Such a curious business, I imagine." Redford turned, surprised by her presence. His gaze flicked over her with mild amusement. "And you are?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "An old lady with an interest in the truth." Redford chuckled. "Then you should know, madame, that the truth is rarely kind." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I dare say. I've found that to be quite the opposite." Redford's smirk faded. He turned back to Whitmore. "I'll give you one last chance. Pay what you owe." Whitmore's face was ashen. "You'll get nothing." Redford's eyes darkened. "Then I wonder what Finch would have said." A heavy silence followed. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Redford knew. He knew what Finch had discovered. Whitmore's hands curled into fists. "Get out." Redford smirked. "For now," and with that, he turned and strode away. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Finch had discovered the truth about Whitmore's past. He had been prepared to use it, but someone had silenced him first. And, now, with Redford back in the picture, the danger was far from over. Chapter 8. A debt unpaid. Miss Marple believed that when a person reached desperation, they were most likely to make mistakes. And after Charles Redford's dramatic confrontation with Lord Whitmore, it was clear that desperation was setting in. As the house settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple took her knitting and quietly retreated to a corner of the drawing room. She knew that tonight would be critical. Somewhere within these walls, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. And she would be there when it was dot. It was nearly midnight when the sound came. A soft creak, a hesitant footstep in the hallway. Miss Marple, seated in her armchair, remained still. The house was supposed to be asleep, and yet someone was moving. She waited. Another sound this time, the quiet click of a door being opened. The study. Miss Marple rose, careful not to disturb the room, and moved towards the hallway. The darkness did not frighten her. It was, in fact, rather useful. She peered around the edge of the doorframe. A figure stood in the study, silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Charles Redford. Miss Marple watched as he rummaged through the desk, his movements impatient. His breath came fast, shallow. He was looking for something. The letter, no doubt, and that meant he had no idea that Miss Marple already had it. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Redford froze. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes narrowed. "You?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Me." Redford straightened, his hand resting on the desk as if to steady himself. "What are you doing sneaking about at this hour, old woman?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "I might ask you the same, Mr. Redford." He let out a low chuckle. "Looking for what I'm owed." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You mean money, of course." His jaw tightened. "You seem to know a lot for someone who wasn't part of this mess." "Oh, but you see, dear Mr. Redford," Miss Marple said lightly, "when you reach my age, you learn to listen. And I have listened very carefully." Redford's eyes darkened. "Then you know that Whitmore is a liar, a cheat. He stole from me years ago, and he thinks he can get away with it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Finch, did he know the truth?" Redford exhaled sharply. "Finch was a fool. But yes, he found something. He was going to use it to his advantage." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And now he is dead." Red's expression flickered just for a moment. Then, he straightened. "Are you accusing me?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "I do not accuse, Mr. Redford. I observe." Redford smirked. "Then observe this. I don't have what I came for." He took a step forward, lowering his voice. "But I will get it." Miss Marple did not flinch. Redford studied her for a long moment, then turned sharply on his heel and strode past her, disappearing into the darkness. Miss Marple let out a breath. Yes, desperation would make a man reckless, and Redford was very, very desperate. The next morning, Miss Marple was not surprised to find Inspector Grayson already waiting in the sitting room, his expression grim. "I had Redford followed last night," he said, rubbing his chin. "He went straight to the village in Patadrine, spoke to no one, then went to his room." Miss Marple nodded. "And Lord Whitmore," Grayson exhaled sharply, "locked himself in his study since yesterday." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Then, I do believe it is time to speak with him." Grayson frowned. "Do you think he'll talk?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, dear Inspector, he doesn't need to. I shall simply listen." Lord Whitmore was a proud man. Even now, as he sat stiffly in his chair, his expression was carefully guarded. Miss Marple seated herself across from him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "A most unfortunate business, isn't it, Lord Whitmore?" Whitmore's fingers tightened around his brandy glass. "If you've come to lecture me, Miss Marple, I have no patience for it." "Oh no, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I have simply come to listen." Whitmore let out a sharp breath. "Then you may listen to this. I owe that man nothing." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "And yet, Mr. Redford seems to believe otherwise." Whitmore's lips thinned. "He's a criminal, a swindler. He ruined his own life." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And you, dear Lord Whitmore, what did you ruin?" Silence. Then, Whitmore slammed his glass onto the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Miss Marple merely smiled. Perhaps. She reached into her knitting basket and withdrew the letter. Whitmore's face drained of color. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Arthur Finch had this in his possession before he was killed." I wonder was he planning to show it to you? Whitmore's throat, bobbed. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. What is in this letter, Lord Whitmore? His breath was shallow. Nothing that concerns you. Miss Marple sighed. I see. Then I suppose I shall simply have to read it aloud. She unfolded the paper. Whitmore lunged forward. No. Miss Marple's voice was steady. Then tell me. Whitmore collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with one hand. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said, It's about my brother. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the letter. Whitmore exhaled. My brother was a soldier. He died under suspicious circumstances. There were whispers that I had a hand in it, that I stood to gain. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. And did you? Whitmore's eyes were hollow. I didn't kill him, but I didn't stop it either. Silence stretched between them. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it neatly on the table. So Finch found the truth. Whitmore nodded slowly. Miss Marple studied him, and someone killed him for it. Whitmore's hands trembled. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple held up a hand. I do not think you did, Lord Whitmore. Whitmore blinked. Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her basket. But I do believe the killer is close. She met his gaze one last time. Then, with a gentle smile, she said, We shall soon have our answer. And with that, she left. Chapter 9. A shadow in the fog. Miss Marple was no stranger to the heavy silence that followed a revelation. Lord Whitmore's confession about his brother had been important, but it was not the final truth. Someone had murdered Arthur Finch, and that someone had done so in a moment of desperation, either to keep a secret buried, or to claim some advantage from it. As she walked through the dimly lit corridors of the Whitmore estate, her sharp mind pieced together the puzzle. Charles Redford was looking for leverage. Lord Whitmore was hiding a painful past. But the real question remained: who had the most to lose? And more importantly, who had the most to gain? It was late when Miss Marple entered the drawing room, where Eleanor Whitmore sat by the fireplace, staring into the embers. She looked weary, her usual composure slipping. Miss Marple took a seat beside her. A penny for your thoughts, my dear. Eleanor let out a breath. I don't know what to think anymore. Miss Marple, my father. This whole business, with his brother. It's as if my whole life has been built on a lie. Miss Marple patted her hand. Truths are rarely convenient, my dear. Eleanor turned to her. You believe my father is innocent? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. I do not think he killed Arthur Finch. Eleanor's shoulders sagged with relief. But then she hesitated. And Charles Redford. Miss Marple's lips pursed. I do believe Mr. Redford is a scoundrel, but I am not yet convinced he is a murderer. Eleanor exhaled. Then who? Miss Marple studied her thoughtfully. Tell me, my dear, where was Dr. Mills on the night of the murder? Eleanor frowned. Dr. Mills? He was supposed to be at the village. He always leaves around 8 and returns late. He says he prefers working at his own practice rather than here. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, he was seen leaving the study that very night. Eleanor's frown deepened. You don't think? But before she could finish, the door swung open, and Miss Pickering burst in, her face pale. There's someone outside. Miss Marple stood immediately, where Miss Pickering pointed towards the French doors, leading to the terrace. I saw a shadow moving. Someone's lurking about. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Eleanor. Then, I do believe we should see who it is. The night air was thick with fog as Miss Marple stepped onto the terrace. Eleanor and Miss Pickering following closely behind. The grounds stretched into darkness, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. A figure moved near the trees, a silhouette, just barely visible through the mist. Stay here, she instructed the two women. Then, gathering her shawl around her shoulders, she made her way down the stone steps. The figure was moving swiftly, but Miss Marple knew these grounds better than most would expect. She took a careful route through the hedges, approaching from the side. And then she saw him. Dr. Mills. He was standing near the gate, his head turning back towards the house as if making sure he hadn't been seen. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle of papers. Miss Marple watched as he hesitated, then stuffed them back inside and strode quickly towards the road. By the time she returned to the terrace, Eleanor and Miss Pickering were waiting anxiously. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Dr. Mills had something to hide. And now she needed to find out what. The next morning, Miss Marple wasted no time. She sent a note to Inspector Grayson, requesting a discreet meeting in the village. The inspector, though often skeptical of her methods, had learned to trust her instincts. They met in the small tea room near the church, where Miss Marple sipped her tea and relayed the events of the previous night. Grayson frowned. Mills was sneaking about the grounds, you say? Miss Marple nodded. And he had something in his possession papers, I believe. Grayson exhaled. Damn fool. I'll have him brought in for questioning. Miss Marple stirred her tea. No, dear Inspector, not yet. Grayson arched a brow. No. Miss Marple's expression was serene. Dr. Mills is afraid, and a frightened man will often reveal far more than a defiant one. Grayson leaned back. So what do you suggest? Miss Marple smiled sweetly. I shall pay him a visit. Dr. Mills's practice was a modest building at the edge of the village. When Miss Marple arrived, the doctor was clearly unsettled by her presence. Miss Marple, he said stiffly, to what do I owe this visit? Miss Marple took a seat, placing her knitting basket on her lap. Oh, just an old woman's curiosity, dear doctor. Mills forced a chuckle. I doubt that very much. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Then perhaps I shall be direct. What were you doing on the Whitmore estate last night? Mills stiffened. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple sighed. Oh, but I do believe you do. She leaned forward slightly. You had papers. Important ones, I suspect. What were they? Mills swallowed. His hands clenched on the desk. You don't understand. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Then help me understand. Mills hesitated. Then, slowly, he opened a drawer and pulled out a folded document. Miss Marple took it carefully, unfolding the paper. Her breath caught. It was an old military report. The name at the top, Thomas Whitmore, Lord Whitmore's brother. Miss Marple glanced up. Where did you get this? Mills exhaled. Arthur Finch gave it to me the night he was killed. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the paper. Finch had this. Mills nodded. He found it in Whitmore's study. He didn't trust the police, so he came to me. Miss Marple's voice was steady. And what does it say? Mills looked away. It proves that Lord Whitmore lied about his brother's death. Miss Marple's mind raced. This was it. The peace Finch had died for. And yet, something still didn't fit. Finch had been killed because of what he knew. But if Mills had this document, then why was he still alive? Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. There was still one more truth to uncover, and she would find it. Chapter 10. The truth beneath the lease. Miss Marple sat in the doctor's office, her sharp eyes scanning the yellowed military report in her hands. The name Thomas Whitmore stood boldly at the top of the page. If Arthur Finch had uncovered something so vital, something that would shake the very foundation of Lord Whitmore's past, then his murder had not been an impulsive act, it had been necessary for the killer. She folded the document neatly and placed it back on the desk. Dr. Mills was watching her, his fingers tapping anxiously against the wood. You see now, Miss Marple, he murmured. Arthur Finch had no idea what he was truly meddling with. He thought he'd uncovered a scandal, but it was far more than that. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. A secret such as this, hidden for so many years. I can see why someone might resort to desperate measures to keep it that way. Dr. Mills let out a slow breath. I had no choice but to keep this hidden. Finch gave it to me just before he died. He told me to protect it. He feared what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. And yet, it seems you were the one sneaking about Whitmore Manor in the dead of night. Why? Mills hesitated. I thought there might be more documents, more proof. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Or were you searching for something to destroy? Mills looked at her sharply. You think Miss Marple gave a gentle smile, but her eyes held firm. I think you have been far too cautious, Dr. Mills, but caution does not make a man a murderer. Mills sagged in relief. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not kill Arthur Finch. I only wanted to understand what he had found. Miss Marple tapped her fingers on the desk. And yet, someone else was willing to silence him forever. She rose to her feet. I shall take this to Inspector Grayson. In the meantime, I suggest you remain precisely where you are, Dr. Mills. Mills swallowed. You think I'm in danger? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I think, dear doctor, that the moment Finch passed you that document, you unknowingly put yourself in the same position he was in. She turned and left, the military report tucked securely in her handbag, back at Whitmore Manor. The tension in the air was thick, enough to cut with a knife. Lord Whitmore sat rigidly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Charles Redford leaned against the fireplace, his usual smug demeanor slightly subdued. But Miss Marple placed the military report on the table between them. Lord Whitmore, I believe you owe us all an explanation. The old man exhaled heavily. This again. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Your brother's death was not as you described it. And now, Arthur Finch has died for knowing too much. Whitmore's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. You think I killed Finch? Miss Marple shook her head. I think someone did, and I think it was because of this. She tapped the report. Tell me, Lord Whitmore, what happened to your brother? A heavy silence fell over the room. Then finally, Whitmore spoke. Thomas. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. Eleanor, who had been standing by the window, gasped. What? Whitmore's face darkened. He disgraced the family. A scandal I buried long ago. I told everyone he had died in service, but the truth is, he was involved in something I could never forgive. He fled. He was never seen again. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, someone has gone to great lengths to keep his name hidden, even now. Redford, who had remained silent until now, let out a low chuckle. So, you buried a family secret, and Finch dug it up, and now he's dead. Whitmore glared at him. You think I did it? Redford shrugged. I think you had a reason. Miss Marple observed them carefully. No, gentlemen. Lord Whitmore may have wished this secret to remain hidden, but I do not believe he murdered Finch. Whitmore scowled. Then who? Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward Eleanor. Tell me, my dear, did Arthur Finch speak to you the night of his murder? Eleanor hesitated. I saw him briefly. He seemed nervous. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And nervous men do foolish things. She turned back to Redford. Tell me, Mr. Redford, where were you the night of the murder? Redford smirked. You've already asked me that, Miss Marple. She smiled. Yes, and I wonder, has your answer changed? Redford's smirk faltered. I was in my room. Miss Marple studied him. And yet, something tells me you were not as alone as you claim. A flicker of something crossed Redford's face, but he quickly masked it. You think I had something to do with it? Miss Marple simply smiled. I think you have a great deal to lose, Mr. Redford. Redford laughed, but it was hollow. Oh, Miss Marple, you do amuse me. Miss Marple inclined her head. We shall see. She turned to Whitmore. For now, Lord Whitmore, I advise you two remain cautious. Someone in this house is willing to kill to keep the past buried. With that, she took her leave, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her guest room, her mind working tirelessly through the facts. Someone had killed Arthur Finch because of what he knew. Someone had searched for the very document now in her possession. And yet, there was still a missing piece. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Eleanor. Miss Marple, she said hesitantly. There's something I didn't tell you. Miss Marple motioned for her to sit. Go on, my dear. Eleanor wrung her hands. The night Arthur Finch was killed, I saw someone. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Who? Eleanor hesitated. It was, but before she could finish, a sharp crash sounded from downstairs. Miss Marple stood immediately. Something was happening, and this time, she was certain it was no accident. Chapter 11. A sudden intrusion, sharp sound of shattering glass sent a jolt through the quiet corridors of Whitmore Manor. Miss Marple, ever composed, wasted no time. She rose swiftly, motioning for Eleanor to stay put. Lock the door behind me, my dear, she instructed, and do not open it unless you hear my voice. Eleanor, wide-eyed, nodded and obeyed as Miss Marple stepped into the dimly lit hallway. Downstairs, footsteps echoed, hurried, unsteady. Someone was moving quickly through the manor. Miss Marple followed the sound, her sharp eyes flicking across the shadows for any sign of movement. As she reached the main hall, she saw Lord Whitmore emerge from his study, holding a brass candlestick, as if prepared to defend himself. His face was grim. What in God's name is going on? He demanded. Before Miss Marple could answer, another figure appeared. Inspector Grayson, his revolver drawn. He had arrived earlier in the evening to follow up on Miss Marple's latest findings, but now, it seemed fate had thrown them into a more urgent predicament. Stay here, Grayson ordered. I'll handle this. Miss Marple, unperturbed, merely followed him as he stalked toward the source of the noise, the drawing room. Inside, the large window was shattered, glass glinting on the carpet. A cold breeze stirred the heavy curtains. The study lamp flickered uncertainly, casting eerie shadows, and near the fireplace stood Dr. Mills. His face was pale, his hands trembling. In one of them, He clutched the same bundle of papers Miss Marple had seen earlier. Grayson lifted his revolver slightly. "Mills, what are you doing here?" Dr. Mills stammered, eyes darting between them. I wasn't, I mean." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You were afraid." Mills let out a shaky breath. "I thought I heard someone outside. I came to see if they had returned." "Who?" Grayson asked sharply. Mills shook his head. "I don't know. But someone has been watching me ever since I received these papers." He gestured weakly to the bundle. "I didn't know what to do. I thought perhaps." His voice trailed off. Miss Marple nodded. "You thought the killer had returned." Mills swallowed hard. "Yes." Grayson lowered his revolver slightly, though his expression remained suspicious. "You should have come to me first." Mills exhaled. "I didn't know who to trust." Miss Marple looked around. If someone was indeed outside, they may still be on the grounds. Grayson turned on his heel. "I'll have my men search the area." As he left, Mills sank into a chair, his face drawn. "I'm a fool." Miss Marple sat across from him. "No, dear doctor, but you are in far greater danger than you realize." Mills let out a hollow laugh. "That much is clear." Miss Marple studied him. "Dr. Mills, I must ask, why did Arthur Finch trust you with this?" Mills hesitated. Then, finally, he whispered, "Because he knew I had my own reasons to keep the truth hidden." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Mills sighed. "Years ago, I discovered something about Lord Whitmore's brother, something that, if revealed, would have destroyed his family." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet, you kept silent." Mills nodded. "I had no choice. I swore to protect that secret." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "But secrets have a way of coming to light, don't they?" Mills ran a hand through his hair. "And now Finch is dead because of it." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. Or perhaps, because someone else had something to lose. A long silence stretched between them. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open. Miss Pickering stood in the doorway, her face tight. "There's something you need to see," she said quietly. In the dimly lit corridor, Miss Pickering led them to the small storage room near the kitchen. Grayson had returned, looking irritable. "I was about to order my men to expand the search," he muttered. Miss Pickering simply pointed inside the room. "You may want to see this first." Grayson frowned and stepped in, Miss Marple and Mills following closely behind. That at first glance, the room appeared unremarkable: wooden shelves lined with linens and supplies. But on the floor, partially hidden beneath a toppled stack of boxes, lay a dark coat, a very familiar coat. Miss Marple bent down, lifting the heavy fabric. "Arthur Finch's." Mills took a sharp breath. "But how?" Miss Pickering pointed to the corner. "I was fetching candles when I noticed something odd. There's a loose panel in the wall." Miss Marple turned her attention to where Pickering indicated. Indeed, one of the wooden panels seemed slightly out of place. She reached forward, pressing gently. With a faint creak, it shifted. A small compartment was revealed. And inside, a silver pocket watch. Grayson picked it up, flipping it open. The initials AF were engraved inside. "Arthur Finch's watch." Miss Marple's gaze darkened. "He was here before he died. He must have hidden these items." Mills looked horrified. "But why would he?" Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. Finch had been running from someone. He had known he was in danger. And yet, instead of escaping outright, he had stopped long enough to hide these things, which meant he had suspected someone inside the house. Miss Marple turned to Grayson. "Inspector, I believe we are very close now." Grayson exhaled. "Then tell me, Miss Marple, who?" Miss Marple glanced at the coat and pocket watch once more. Then, ever so softly, she said, "Someone who wanted Finch silenced. Someone who knew exactly what he had found." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And someone who was still among us." A heavy silence filled the room. Mills swallowed. "You mean?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. The murderer is not lurking in the shadows." She met their eyes. "They are right here in this house." Chapter 12. Unmasking the murderer. Deep silence fell over the room, thick with unspoken tension. Miss Marple stood with quiet composure, her sharp eyes glancing from one face to another. Dr. Mills shifted uncomfortably. Miss Pickering folded her hands tightly. Inspector Grayson's grip on the silver pocket watch was firm, his expression unreadable. "The murderer," Miss Marple said at last, her voice calm but certain, "has been among us from the very start." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Then, I hope you are ready to name them, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Oh yes, Inspector, I believe I am." She turned toward Lord Whitmore. who stood near the doorway, his posture rigid. "Your lordship, I must ask, where were you truly on the night of Arthur Finch's murder?" Whitmore bristled. "I have already told. Why, I was in my study." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, I find that rather difficult to believe." Whitmore scowled. "What are you implying, madame?" Miss Marple's voice was unwavering. "That you had far more to lose than you ever let on." She turned toward the others. "At first I believed Arthur Finch was murdered because he had uncovered a family scandal, a hidden past, buried for decades. But that was not the true reason." Mills frowned. "It wasn't." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear doctor. It was not Lord Whitmore's family secret that sealed Finch's fate." She glanced toward the pocket watch in Grace's hand. "It was what Finch saw." A slow, uneasy silence followed. Miss Pickering inhaled sharply. "You mean, the night he died?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed." She took a step forward. "Arthur Finch was an observant man, you see. And on the night of his murder, he saw something, or rather, someone that he should not have." She turned to Eleanor, who had remained silent until now. "Eleanor, my dear, you told me something just before the disturbance earlier. Something you never got the chance to finish." Eleanor hesitated. I saw someone that night." Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "Yes, and I believe it is time you told us who." Eleanor swallowed. It was a sharp crash, interrupted her. The sound of breaking china echoed from the corridor beyond. Inspector Grayson reacted first. Striding swiftly toward the noise, Miss Marple followed, her expression unreadable. As they entered the hallway, they found Charles Redford standing rigidly near a broken vase. His face was pale, his fingers trembling. Grayson scowled. "What's this then?" Redford's gaze flickered toward Miss Marple. "I just heard shouting." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Or did you hear something else?" Redford's jaw tightened. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "You were the last person to see Arthur Finch alive, weren't you?" Redford stiffened. "That's absurd." "I told you I was in my room." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, and yet Eleanor saw someone near the gardens that night. Someone moving toward the very place Finch was later found dead." A sharp silence followed. Redford forced a chuckle. "You're making wild assumptions, Miss Marple," but her expression remained unchanged. "I assure you, I am not." She took a step closer. Arthur Finch had been running from something, and he ran toward the garden, the place where he had hidden his coat and pocket watch. But before he could retrieve them, he was stopped. Her voice dropped slightly. "He was stopped by you, Mr. Redford." A flicker of something passed over Redford's face. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Well, Redford, have you anything to say?" Redford licked his lips. "This is madness. I had no reason to kill him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, but you did." She gestured toward the military report on the nearby table. "Arthur Finch discovered something more than an old family scandal. He discovered your past, did he not?" Redford's face darkened. "My past?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, a past that you had gone to great lengths to conceal. A past linked to Lord Whitmore's brother." Whitmore's face twisted in confusion. "What nonsense is this?" Miss Marple turned toward him. "Your brother, Thomas Whitmore, was not the only man who disappeared from military records." She fixed her gaze on Redford. "You were once known by another name, were you not?" A slow, chilling silence fell over the room. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Arthur Finch recognized you. He knew who you truly were, and you couldn't let that happen." Redford's breathing was uneven now. You can't prove anything." Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "Oh, but I can." Arthur Finch, in his final moments, tried to hide the truth. He left behind small clues: a pocket watch, a coat, and above all, his notes. She gestured to the bundle of papers still in Dr. Mills's trembling hands. "He had written something down, something crucial, and I suspect we shall find your real name in there, Mr. Redford." A heavy pause. Then, Redford lunged. Grayson reacted instantly, grabbing Redford's arm before he could reach the papers. The two men struggled, but Grayson was stronger. Within moments, Redford was forced against the wall, his breath ragged. Grayson pulled out his handcuffs. "Charles Redford, or whoever you truly are, you are under arrest for the murder of Arthur Finch." Redford let out a low, bitter laugh. "You're making a mistake." Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. "I think not." Grayson secured the cuffs and turned toward Miss Marple. "I don't know how you do it, but once again, you were right." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "It is simply a matter of paying attention. Inspector Redford's shoulders sagged in defeat. The truth had been uncovered at last. And with that, the mystery was finally solved. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.